I am just going to come out and say it. Baldur's Gate 2 is the most influential Western role-playing game ever made. That might change someday, but for now it's really impossible to understand the way modern role-playing games look and feel without first digging into Baldur's Gate 2. But how was Baldur's Gate 2 made, and why exactly did it become so popular? Well, that is what we're here to discuss, but before we dive in, I want to thank Matthias from Sweden, who is a VIP supporter of this channel on Patreon. Thank you very much for your support. Grab a snack, get a drink, and get comfortable, because this is the definitive story of the making of Baldur's Gate 2. And like the game itself, it's going to be a journey. Okay, so I did a deep dive on the founding of BioWare in my prior video about Baldur's Gate, so check that out if you want the complete story. I'll link to it in the description of this video. But here's the basics.
BioWare was founded by a group of 6 in the mid-90s to make Shattered Steel, a moderately successful MechWarrior clone. But the studio had aspirations to do a role-playing game, and in fact, BioWare's first serious RPG concept was a massively multiplayer game called Battlefield Infinity. The studio pitched it to publishers and received a counteroffer from Fergus Urquhart. He's currently the CEO of Obsidian Entertainment, but in the 90s he led a division at Interplay. The company had rights to Dungeons & Dragons and asked BioWare to build a single-player RPG based on the license.
The result was Baldur's Gate. In my prior video, I called Baldur's Gate the game that saved Western computer role-playing games, and I stick to that. The genre was in a dismal state by 1997, as franchises like Ultima, Lands of Lore, and Wizardry no longer held the same appeal that they once did. Baldur's Gate reversed that trend, selling hundreds of thousands of copies in its first year, as critics lavished it with Game of the Year awards.
Baldur's Gate proved that innovation was still possible in the computer role-playing genre. BioWare took full advantage of the game's massive popularity and excellent sales. It hired aggressively, expanded its office, and used its newfound stardom to spin up multiple new projects, the first of which was the 3D third-person action game Murder Death Kill 2. The company also licensed out the Baldur's Gate Infinity engine, leading to the Black Isle Studios' development of Planescape Torment and the Icewind Dale series. But, of course, the success of Baldur's Gate demanded a follow-up, and BioWare wasted no time getting to work. In fact, the developers on the game probably should have taken a break, if only for their mental health, but we'll get to that.
As mentioned in my prior video about the original Baldur's Gate, early planning for the game envisioned it as a single level 1 through 20 campaign and beyond. But the team backed away from that idea pretty quickly, at first toying with the idea of releasing a debut game and then following it up with smaller bite-sized expansions, then later settling on a more traditional approach of releasing a trilogy. As a result, deciding the general direction of the game did not require much brainstorming. The general outline was already there. There wasn't much need to explain the game's concepts to a new team either, because many of the developers who worked on the original Baldur's Gate continued on to work on the sequel.
This includes programmer Mark Dara, lead artist John Gallagher, producer Ben Smedstad, line producer Andrew Nobbs, lead writer James Ohlen, and designers Luke Christiansen and John Winsky, among others. If any of those names sound familiar, it's probably because many members of this team continued to work with BioWare until rather recently. Mark Dara, for example, was executive producer on the entire Dragon Age series, while James Ohlen was involved in design for most BioWare role-playing games up to and through Mass Effect Andromeda.
With the team already in place, the focus of planning quickly shifted to finding ways to improve the sequel. Baldur's Gate was of course very well received by critics, but that doesn't mean there wasn't room for improvement, and some critics had pointed out a few flaws.
Some critics had shaved a star off Baldur's Gate for its lackluster AI pathfinding, undercooked multiplayer mode, limited character customization, and uneven writing. The pathfinding and character customization issues were sore points for fans as well, and became the top complaints on the company's forums. This did not fall on deaf ears. BioWare co-founder Ray Musica, writing in a postmortem for Game Developer magazine, said they became key to the team's early planning. In the postmortem, he said, quote, "We used 2 routes. The first was to make an internal list, generated by BioWare and our publisher Black Isle, of what was feasible and reasonable considering the engine. And the second was to ask the fans what they wanted to see. Fortunately, in the case of Baldur's Gate 2, a number of fans on the news groups already had done much of the work for us and compiled a list of what they wanted to see in Baldur's Gate 2.
While putting together a list of improvements, new features, and bug fixes was not difficult, the team had to make a much harder decision when it came to the game's core technology. Although well regarded both at the time and today, the Infinity Engine was quickly becoming a relic of 2D gaming in an industry rapidly moving towards 3D.
The Infinity Engine also had problems. The multiplayer was a pain for both designers and programmers, and there was a certain inconsistency to how the engine handled areas of terrain that were open to interaction. Because they were drawn on top of the art instead of a part of it, players could see some misalignment between where characters could walk and where it appeared they should walk. The engine also had issues with how it tracked items in the game, which could cause headaches for level designers as well as the QA team. Despite the problems, BioWare decided to stick with the Infinity Engine. Trent Oster, in an interview for BioWare's 25th anniversary book, said that, quote, "The key thing about Baldur's Gate 2 was that it was bubblegum and duct tape together by people who really understood the bubblegum and the duct tape."
And that really seems to have been the deciding factor. BioWare was of course interested in creating a new 3D game engine for future games, and it did exactly that for Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic and Neverwinter Nights. However, creating a new game engine for Baldur's Gate 2 would require time that the studio did not have. Sticking with the Infinity Engine served a very important strategic purpose for BioWare as a company. It helped to quickly produce Baldur's Gate 2 while other teams at the company were working on new games with the newer 3D engines. If you take it out of BioWare's library of role-playing games, then you would end up with a 4-year gap between Baldur's Gate, which was released in late 1998, and Neverwinter Nights, which didn't come until 2002.
While the Infinity Engine was not drastically revised for the sequel, it was graced with a bump from 640 by 480 to 800 by 600 resolution, and 3D accelerated lighting effects for those with 3D hardware. Of the two, the first seems the most significant. Blizzard's Diablo 2, which also released in 2000, originally hit the market at 640 by 480 resolution. It did receive an upgrade with the expansion, and the game's fuzzy visuals at launch were among the few serious criticisms thrown its way. Baldur's Gate 2 looked sharp by comparison.
So by early 1999, Baldur's Gate 2 was well on its way in development, and the team entered the project with a much better sense of what was important. Many improvements were planned, but of course the key to it all was the incredible plot and massive game world, which far exceeded anything seen in a previous computer role-playing game. The team knew they wanted Baldur's Gate 2 to be a mind-blowing epic. Of course, delivering that would not be easy. Because the gist of the story of Baldur's Gate was outlined from the beginning of the original title, the end of Baldur's Gate left plenty for the sequel to resolve. Yet there's a lot more to writing than making an outline, and the writing team, taking lessons from the original, saw many ways to improve the plot of Baldur's Gate 2.
It starts with the villain, the mysterious John Irenicus, who appears from nowhere to kidnap, imprison, and experiment on the player character and their companions. Like Sarvok, the antagonist of Baldur's Gate, Irenicus is established as a brutal, merciless foe, but unlike Sarvok, who is rarely seen after his initial appearance and has no real personality beyond villainy, Baldur's Gate 2 makes a point of fleshing out Irenicus. The reason for his mysterious obsession with the children of Bhaal is explained through a series of dream sequences and later a critical mid-game conflict. Irenicus also abducts Imwen, the player character's sister, and the first companion players can add to the party in the original game.
Now this gives the player plenty of reason to despise Irenicus and work against his plan. This aspect of the game's plot is not perfect since it doesn't really matter how much time you take to save Imwen, but it does provide a stronger hook than the revenge plot of the first game, which centers around the murder of an adopted father you barely have a chance to know.
Now, while Irenicus is almost comically evil, his plans do run deeper than cruelty or power for power's sake, which is another intentional improvement over the original. Baldur's Gate is a fun tale, but not a surprising one, and Sarvok comes off like the villain of a Saturday morning cartoon rather than a fleshed-out character you might expect from a game that's really meant for an adult audience.
The sequel is a lot more successful at making its antagonist a character with warped yet understandable motivation. And the fourth chapter of Baldur's Gate 2 is, I think, a key area that really shows how the writing team had learned from the first title.
After a great deal of effort, the player finally reaches Spellhold, where Imoen and Irenicus are held by the cowled wizards. It quickly becomes clear that Irenicus' dismissive attitude towards his captors was no bluff and that he controls Spellhold. As the player, you feel a mix of excitement and dread. Excitement that you are near the goal of freeing your friend, which has been the driving motivation of the game so far, but also dread as you wonder about the extent of Irenicus' powers.
What unfolds in Spellhold is really a twist on multiple levels. You regain Imoen, but you lose your soul, and you learn what it means to truly be a child of Bhaal. You also find that Spellhold, which was supposed to be a prison for the magically criminal and insane, has been turned into Irenicus' personal laboratory. And you eventually ally with the inmates of that prison, now treated as mere experiments, to overthrow him. It's my personal favorite section of the game. It gives the player new motivations, fills out details of your mysterious lineage, and also fleshes out the reasons why Irenicus is doing what he's doing, all within a span of just a few hours.
This section also underscores the room for player expression in Baldur's Gate 2. The original game didn't include much of an evil path, although that had more to do with TSR, the company that owned D&D, than with the writers at BioWare. TSR had a strict code of conduct that ensured a clear-cut heroic story was the only viable option for the first Baldur's Gate game. But TSR was also in decline, and in 1997, it was bought by Wizards of the Coast. The change in management came with a more permissive attitude that let BioWare explore the evil side of the alignment chart. In fact, Baldur's Gate 2 goes out of its way to make sure even lawful good players can't entirely keep out of the muck and mire. Players face an initial choice to help either the Shadow Thieves Guild or Bodhi's vampires. This is a clear-cut choose the lesser of two evils situation, and while the Shadow Thieves are widely regarded to be the lesser of the two evils, helping them can require a real leap of faith if you're playing a good paladin, cleric, or another good aligned character. Players face similar dilemmas in the 4th chapter, where they must first decide who to trust in their effort to enter Spellhold, and then how to treat the Spellhold inmates and staff now turned into lab rats.
So evil was back in fashion, but, well, only kind of. Baldur's Gate 2 offers notably more evil dialogue options in quests. You can resort to intimidation, extortion, and outright murder, or manslaughter at the very least at times. There's also a variety of weapons and armor that can only be used by evil characters or those who don't mind taking a hit to their reputation at the very least.
Still, despite the new options, Baldur's Gate 2 always ends the same way, with more distinct good and evil paths only relevant in the Throne of Bhaal expansion. Even those, I think, come off as a bit ham-fisted. There's nothing like the save the council or save the fleet moment in Mass Effect, where you see the immediate consequences of your choice affect characters you know and may be attached to. And while Baldur's Gate 2 does have an alignment and reputation system, it's not too difficult to play a violent thug with a sterling reputation, so long as you avoid murdering passerby in cold blood.
Despite its limitations, the addition of more evil character choices in Baldur's Gate 2 is a boon to the game overall. It gives the player more opportunity to express the personality of their character, even if it is ultimately restrained within a linear and predetermined plot. And the game offers this in another important way: romance.
Baldur's Gate 2 was the first BioWare game to have romance subplots. Writers David Gaider and Luke Christiansen got the idea after noticing forum posts about Baldur's Gate. The original release did not include romance, but some players saw a romantic connection in the game's NPC banter. They imagined themselves entangled based on a suggestive tone in a voice line, or through reading between lines of dialogue. The writers had planned to elaborate further on the player character's relationship with other party members, so why not add romantic relationships? There were only 4 romance options in the original release of Baldur's Gate 2, a slim selection that's only a quarter of all the NPCs that can join your party in Baldur's Gate 2. The writers had never tried something like this before and found it very difficult to put together options that made sense within the game's massive narrative. Jaheira's romance, written by Luke Christiansen, became the most complex, so much so that it shipped with numerous timing bugs that could cause the romance to end without the player knowing.
Gaider wrote the other romance choices, which were much smaller in scope. Given the larger number of romance options that he had to write and the fact that they were not necessarily a high priority, Gaider decided to focus each on simply the core of that character's personality.
In an interview, Gaider said that, quote, "I was trying to take Imoen and figure out, okay, how would you romance this guy? I didn't give any thought really to who the audience was or if it would be an emotional thing. I just thought, if this were a story I were writing like a book, how would it play out? The romance options point to the final core improvement of the writing in Baldur's Gate 2, its maturity and consistency. The original game was a massive feat of writing, but it could seem a bit slapstick at times. The team purposely tried to reel this in with the sequel, toning down the number of silly NPCs and providing more mature plotlines for most characters. The writing team also added a mandate to avoid the use of accents, to cut out random dialogue the player can't avoid, and to keep the length of written responses from NPCs to a few lines at most.
These rules were not followed in all cases, but they were more often than not, and it gives the game a more consistent feel than the original. The original Baldur's Gate has the feel of a lazy Friday night tabletop role-playing game where everyone is a few beers in. Baldur's Gate 2 is more like a novel with a plot tightly tuned to provide a specific tone from the beginning to the end.
You might not notice this today if you play Baldur's Gate 2 on its own, but if you play the game back to back with the original, well, I think the difference is pretty clear. Okay, yes, I know I've spent a lot of time on the plot, but it's for good reason. When you come down to it, the game's narrative and the way it is presented is the reason Baldur's Gate 2 became so influential.
At a final tally of 1.2 million words, Baldur's Gate 2's narrative scope is far beyond any of its contemporaries, and it was delivered alongside numerous dialogue options plus a large cast of recruitable NPC characters, which in some cases could lead to lasting romance. All of this is why the writing of Baldur's Gate 2 was a triumph, especially for the time, but of course, it wasn't the only thing that contributed to the game's success. Hey, you're still with me, that's awesome. You know, videos like this take a lot of time to produce, and that's only possible with the help of the patrons on Patreon. I'm gonna put a list of them up right over here. Thank you very much for your support. Now, if you're liking this video so far and you wanna see more like it, of course, feel free to join them on Patreon. You'll find a link to it in the description. Of course, if it's not possible to support on Patreon, then please like and subscribe the video, and be sure to share it with anyone you know who was into Baldur's Gate or Baldur's Gate 2 back in the day. Now with that, let's get back to the history of Baldur's Gate 2. The original Baldur's Gate is based on the Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition role-playing system, which is arguably the system that took it from a small hobbyist project to a smash hit. That might lead you to think that Baldur's Gate would have a deep and complex character creation and progression system, but that's not really the case.
Early editions of Dungeons & Dragons had a pretty lean character creation and progression system in the base rules. This was expanded by official and unofficial supplements, not to mention house rules, but none of that made its way into Baldur's Gate. The Baldur's Gate games also largely lack a system for skill checks, so those differences are absent as well. That left gameplay often feeling more similar than different across different character classes. Sure, a paladin ended up with a few extra spells, but the feel of playing the paladin often wasn't that different from playing a fighter or a melee-focused ranger. BioWare wanted to fix that for Baldur's Gate 2, and to do that, it embraced a popular optional feature of Dungeons & Dragons: character kits. Kits were class variations that first appeared in 1989's The Complete Fighter's Handbook, a critical D&D sourcebook designed to address the notorious lack of options and general lack of excitement surrounding D&D's fighter class. Baldur's Gate 2 also added 3 new classes: the Barbarian, Monk, and Sorcerer. The new kits and classes more than tripled the number of character class options available to the player. The character kits and classes in Baldur's Gate 2 are actually a sort of hybrid between Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition, which is the rule set used by the game, and D&D's 3rd edition, which includes the Barbarian, Monk, and Sorcerer as options in the player's handbook. There is a reason for this hybrid approach.
As I had mentioned, TSR was acquired by Wizards of the Coast in 1997, and the new owners geared up to release a new version of D&D, the 3rd edition, in 2000. Wizards wanted BioWare to use the 3rd edition rule set for Baldur's Gate 2 so that the game could be shipped with 3rd edition branding, but BioWare pushed back. The Infinity Engine was based on the 2nd edition rule set, and the development of Baldur's Gate 2 was already underway. Changing the rule set mid-project was not a simple task and would have required a pretty significant rewrite of how the engine worked. Adding classes did not require such a significant overhaul, however, so BioWare was happy to include classes found in the 3rd edition, such as the Barbarian, the Monk, and the Sorcerer.
I actually think this compromise was rather effective. I had no idea Baldur's Gate 2 did not use the 3rd edition rules until years after I played the game. In fact, I later rolled a barbarian in a D&D 3rd edition campaign specifically because I liked playing my barbarian in Baldur's Gate 2. I didn't learn the true order of events until I started to do my research for the previous video I made on Baldur's Gate.
Improving character progression was the main reason for adding the kits and new classes to Baldur's Gate 2, but it also had some benefits for class balance. In the original release of Baldur's Gate, there is a pretty heavy skew in favor of classes that can cast a wide variety of spells. Now, the Fighter and Paladin definitely are not useless, and in fact, it's often best for new players to Baldur's Gate or Baldur's Gate 2 to pick these classes because they have a lot of hit points, and because the death of the player character always means the end of the game in the Baldur's Gate titles. However, in general, a well-played mage or cleric can far outclass the capabilities of a fighter or paladin in the original game.
Adding kits helped to solve this problem in Baldur's Gate 2. Now, to be fair, mages are still generally considered to be the most capable class in the game, but some of the martial classes can also become quite absurdly broken. Class tier rankings will depend on who you ask, but the Kinsai, Inquisitor, and Archer are examples of martial classes in Baldur's Gate 2 that can be incredibly lethal and have extremely powerful, useful buffs that render some enemy attacks completely pointless. And there's one other thing that helps immensely with character progression and choice in the sequel. Characters start with at least 89,000 experience, possibly more for imported characters from the first game, and that puts them around 5th to 7th level depending on the class. That was really good news because even to this day, most classes in D&D don't get truly interesting until at least the 3rd level, and it's usually the 5th to 7th level where major upgrades and options begin to appear.
This was an important design choice, and to be clear, it was very much a choice. Yes, Baldur's Gate was originally envisioned as a single story, and it is typical, of course, for progression to carry on between sessions in a tabletop role-playing game.
However, forcing the player to more or less start over progression from scratch is actually the more common approach. Think about it. BioWare's Mass Effect and Dragon Age franchises, for example, always start the player at level 1. Now, your choices carry over from the prior games, but your character progression does not.
From a design perspective, having players start over their progression is a big benefit when bringing in players that haven't played the earlier title. And when you think about it, even the story of Baldur's Gate 2 could have provided a good excuse for doing exactly that.
You were imprisoned and experimented on. Perhaps that erased the player character's memory or sapped their strength.
But BioWare decided not to do that, putting players deeper into the progression curve of Dungeons & Dragons from the very start.
Now, there's one final aspect of character progression in Baldur's Gate 2 that, like the game's romances, had a surprisingly big influence on role-playing games, and that's the strongholds. Fighters can become the ruler of a keep, a bard can end up running the 5 Flagons Inn and Playhouse, and so on. Each stronghold comes with some unique quests as well, which in some cases will lead to truly excellent loot. Now, the strongholds are a bit of a mixed bag. They are notoriously finicky even in the Enhanced Edition release, and in some cases it is possible to unknowingly lock yourself out of a stronghold by making the wrong choice. Despite this, strongholds were popular and had a big impact on future role-playing games. This is not only true of some BioWare titles like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, but also the spiritual successors of the Infinity Engine games like Pillars of Eternity and Pathfinder Kingmaker. Those two games were so obsessed with the stronghold idea that they made it a core part of their respective campaigns.
On the whole, I think it is very, very clear that the improved progression in Baldur's Gate 2 is a big benefit to the game and the franchise overall. And it was even a major leap forward for all role-playing games at the time. Today it is actually kind of hard to understand how big of a leap Baldur's Gate 2 was because the Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition takes all of the character kits and other progression perks of the sequel and incorporates them into the first game. The wide range of options in the sequel reinforced the game's epic scope, and it added replayability to a game that was already among the longest narrative RPGs ever made. With so many characters, side quests, and areas, you might wonder how the team at BioWare managed to keep it all organized. And that, in fact, proved to be an epic journey of its own. If there's one thing that ties together the entirety of the Baldur's Gate franchise from the first game to the Throne of Bhaal expansion, it is epic completeness. It's a long game, is what I'm trying to say. Baldur's Gate 2 takes around 40 to 50 hours to complete, even if you really mainline the story, and the expansion adds another 20 hours, again, if you just stick to the main story.
Baldur's Gate 2 includes as much written content as the first 4 books in George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, combined. Naturally, keeping a project of this size organized is difficult even for modern game studios with hundreds of employees. Fortunately, the experience of creating Baldur's Gate gave the team a chance to reflect on what had and hadn't worked during the creation of the original. Ray Musica, writing in a Baldur's Gate 2 postmortem for Game Developer magazine, said that, quote, "One thing we definitely didn't want to do with Baldur's Gate 2 was make some of the same design mistakes that we had followed with the original game. Since some of our team members were brand new, and since many of our memories seemed rather porous, we decided to make up a set of guidelines."
I'm not going to go through all of the guidelines here because there's a lot of them, but if you want to see them all, you'll find a link to the article in the description below. The Baldur's Gate 2 team wanted the sequel to seem larger, more organized, and more structured, while pursuing the somewhat contradictory goal of making the game world feel more like a world instead of a series of levels explored in a roughly linear series of events.
Pinning responsibility for the structure of a game as large as Baldur's Gate 2 on one person is always dicey business, but if there's anyone who deserves the title of mastermind, then it's probably James Ohlen. A very early hire at BioWare, his role at the company quickly expanded from writer to leader as BioWare grew from a little more than a dozen to, by the time of the release of Baldur's Gate 2, about 100 employees. Despite being at the company for only a few years, Ohlen had earned the title of Director of Writing and Design. Dave Gaider, who was hired as a lead writer early in the development of Baldur's Gate 2, said in an interview with Shack News that, quote, "James Ohlen was basically the architect of the story and the individual quests. He would talk to the writers a lot. We would brainstorm a lot and work on the overarching idea together, but when it came to an individual quest, he would write out a sort of, this is basically what happens from beat to beat to beat." Still, Ohlen's attentions were focused on the core narrative. The writers were given far more leeway when crafting side quests. Gaider, for example, was given the task of fleshing out the Copper Coronet, an inn that becomes a key early quest hub. Gaider was essentially told to fill it up with extra things, and filled up he did, adding numerous side quests outside the scope of the core narrative. The day-to-day organization of the game's many volumes of quest text was handled in a dialogue tool called Dottie. The origins of Dottie are a little unclear, but I think this was not really a tool built from the ground up by BioWare, and instead an adaptation of an open-source graphic visualization tool called GraphViz that was originally developed by AT&T in the early 1990s. Dottie was the name of the tool's graphical user interface. You can still download GraphViz today, as the tool is still open source and has a small but active community. Whatever its origins, the team pushed Dottie to its limits. Luke Christiansen said that, quote, "To view some of the larger conversations, you had to zoom out so far you couldn't read the text. Some were beautiful, almost crystalline." In fact, the team sometimes pushed Dottie beyond its limits. The game's largest and most complex storylines, like the Jahira romance and the Thieves Guild questline, could cause the program to slow to a crawl or crash entirely.
As important as the tool was, it's important to note that writing dialogue in Dottie was just one part of a very long process. The art team then had to create art for the levels as well as any monsters and NPCs that had not yet been made for the game. Then it was up to the programmers to actually implement what the design and writing teams had in mind. The Baldur's Gate 2 team knew from the lessons learned developing the first game that it was important to keep everyone on the team organized. In order to do that, they created a roughly 8-stage content pipeline. It began with the writers and designers creating the overall narrative and arc for a particular part of the game. This was followed by concept art, then character models, and then design and art of the level itself. Then came finishing touches on the art of everything that was in the level, and then came the programmers who had to actually get into the nitty-gritty of making everything work as intended. Now, the pipeline was actually wildly successful. Baldur's Gate 2 was developed in only 2 years after all. But it wasn't perfect. The team's efforts to improve the speed of developing the game were definitely successful, but the new speed led to quality control and communication issues of their own.
As the project rolled on, the team realized the content pipeline didn't include any early QA testing, which meant large chunks of Baldur's Gate 2 received no formal QA testing until the final months of development. This became a problem, and it could lead to a variety of errors. An item key to a quest might be missing because it was never added to the level by a designer, or a doorway might be gone because the art team never drew it in. Originally, the team had planned to place similar amounts of content through the game, but as development went on, the team and the narrative team in particular realized the rapid content pipeline was generating too much content and had to trim it back. This is why the second and third chapters contain the bulk of the game's optional side content, some of which can be wrapped up in the sixth chapter. The other chapters are more linear and generally shorter. In fact, while I'll admit I've never timed it, I think it's fair to say the second and third chapters are longer than all of the other chapters combined.
The wealth of content that is in the second and third chapters of Baldur's Gate 2 is a bit odd in some respects and might be considered a flaw. This is because the first chapter seems to set up a very tense situation where you are desperate to find Imoen, who has been abducted by Irenicus, but then the game sort of lets you loose to do whatever you'd like. On the other hand though, this potential flaw is perhaps a reason that Baldur's Gate 2 manages to achieve a sense of possibility that other computer role-playing games of the era, and even many that are released today, cannot quite match.
The player immediately has incredible freedom to explore the city of Ohlen, and then the countryside beyond at their own leisure, and in pursuit of the side quests that seem most interesting to them. Ultimately, Baldur's Gate 2 managed to avoid becoming the team's sophomore slump. Baldur's Gate hadn't taught BioWare everything about building an RPG, but the team was definitely successful in building on its prior efforts to produce a game that was at once larger and filled with more possibility, yet also more consistent and enjoyable in its moment-to-moment gameplay.
With that said, it was not only efficiency and experience that allowed the team to crank out Baldur's Gate 2 in only 2 years, and that brings us to the dark side of the game's development. In my video about the development of Baldur's Gate, I covered one of its worst issues, and that was the crunch. It was bad, but if you want a summary, just consider this quote from Augustine Yip.
We were just exhausted. Game development was 18-hour days, no exercise, poor nutrition, literally pizzas and Coke for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Now, if you're wondering who Augustine Yip is, well, he was actually the third doctor involved with the founding of BioWare. Most people don't remember him for this role today because he ended up leaving the company around the end of development of Baldur's Gate.
So, did things get better with Baldur's Gate 2? Well, it depends on who you ask. Writer David Gaider said that, quote, "The only story I ever tell about Baldur's Gate 2 is that it was the worst crunch I ever worked in my life." He went on to say working at BioWare was at once demanding and friendly, stating that, quote, "Everybody was very casual. If somebody was in their office and they didn't want to wear pants, well, that would happen. There was an artist there who would play porn on his computer. He'd just have it playing. Didn't worry about it, didn't care what anyone else thought." On the other hand, James Ohlen told Computer Gaming World magazine that the crunch on Baldur's Gate 2 was a bit less intense than the first game, saying that, quote, "We have long hours, 12 to 14 hours a day, but we don't have people sleeping over at work. With Baldur's Gate, there were longer hours, a lot more stress, and tempers ran higher." Ray Musica also painted a more positive view of The Office, claiming in a post-mortem article he wrote for Game Developer magazine that The Office was, quote, "strangely serene," and that the company never experienced that sense of panic it had prior to shipping Baldur's Gate.
As far as I can tell, the entire team seems to have crunched to some degree throughout the entire development of Baldur's Gate 2. Different parts of the team took the brunt of the crunch at different times, with the writers and artists having the worst of it at the beginning of the development, and the programmers getting the worst of it near the end. Now, even those who weren't necessarily a part of the development team were not safe from the game's crunch. Interviews suggest that employees who weren't overwhelmed with their own projects often were brought in as QA testers on Baldur's Gate 2. Even BioWare co-founder Ray Musica got in on this at times, working late into the evening, replaying the same quests time and time again.
The crunch also occurred in the backdrop of a company that had changed a lot in just a few short years. Baldur's Gate was the center of BioWare's attention during its development, which grew in tandem with the growth of the studio. Baldur's Gate 2, on the other hand, was only one of several projects underway. Out of a total of 100 employees working at BioWare by 2000, only 20 to 35 were assigned to Baldur's Gate 2 at any one time. The rest were working on Murder Death Kill 2, which was also released in 2000, and Neverwinter Nights, which was already deep into development. Some were beginning to work on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, which was just beginning to enter its production phase toward the end of the development of Baldur's Gate 2.
Now, in the end, I think there is a undeniable and perhaps unfortunate truth to the development of Baldur's Gate 2, and that is that it probably would not have been possible without crunch.
And yet, despite the incredible effort put in by the entire team, they were still forced to cut back or entirely discard several key features. The most important among these was, again, multiplayer. BioWare had hoped players might use Baldur's Gate as a multiplayer pen and paper adventure, but players despised the dialogue system, which paused the entire game when any character initiated dialogue. This made playing with strangers an exercise in frustration. Baldur's Gate 2 tried to fix multiplayer with a hybrid pause system that only paused the entire game for dialogue critical to the narrative.
However, it still ended up being a disjointed experience because players could easily miss quest text that was vital to a side quest. Also, this didn't really do anything to address some of the broader class balance and party balance issues that were involved with multiplayer Baldur's Gate 2.
Despite the challenges, the team had actually wanted to expand the multiplayer in Baldur's Gate 2 with a new deathmatch mode. There's not a lot of detailed information about this mode, but it seems to have been an arena where player characters could duke it out in a style similar to player versus player combat in Ultima Online or Diablo. According to Ray Musica's postmortem, the feature was cut only in the final stretch as the team locked in what would and would not make it to release, and he cited it as a feature the team should have abandoned much earlier in development. Deathmatch wasn't the only thing cut at the last moment. James Ohlen wanted to include a major side plot in which the first game's antagonist, Sarvok, would seize control of the planar sphere and use it to create an alternative history where he is successful in taking over the Sword Coast. It was meant to add some detail to Sarvok, who does appear in Baldur's Gate 2 at several points, but it was dropped due to time constraints. In the end, it's probably fair to say much of the additional character development that might have been added to this questline was pushed to the Throne of Bhaal expansion, where Sarvok plays a more important role. The final fight with Irenicus was also revised and shortened towards the end of development because, to quote a Computer Gaming World preview, the QA department thought it sucked. The same article also quotes Ohlen as saying, "We always listen to QA. They're really representative of the people who are going to play the game." So, the end was revised to the state it shipped in, a relatively short encounter that only asked players to resolve a basic puzzle before going toe-to-toe with the antagonist. This same Computer Gaming World preview, which was published in November of 1999, paints the picture of a team that's at once scattered and confident. Crunch continued right up to release, mostly in an effort to fix bugs. The article reports staff working long into the night and coming in on weekends. Yet despite the workload, the team maintained its composure up to the very end.
Baldur's Gate 2 is of course not a perfect game, but it is excellent and undeniably ambitious for a game from its era. And ultimately, that ambition did pay off. Baldur's Gate 2 hit store shelves on September 21st, 2000, and reached European countries about a week later. Unsurprisingly, the success of the first game, along with the quick release of a sequel, led to excellent sales right out of the gate. While it never reached the #1 spot in PC Data's sales charts for the United States, it sold about 200,000 copies in its first year and reached #2 on the month of its release. The success of Baldur's Gate is notable not only for how it affected BioWare as a company, but also how it impacted the lives of the developers on the project. Despite the long hours and grueling crunch, BioWare's top talent did not seem eager to go anywhere, and were involved in later hit RPGs like Mass Effect and the Dragon Age franchise. This of course includes writing and design director James Ohlen, who was involved with just about every BioWare role-playing game through 2018.
It also includes writer Luke Chris Johnson, who is still with BioWare, writer David Gaider, who was at BioWare until 2016, designer Brent Knowles, who stayed through 2009, designer John Winsky, who stayed through 2012. Other notable names include Mark Dara, who became executive producer and left BioWare only in 2020, and Rob Bartel, who was heavily involved as a producer and designer on the Dragon Age series through 2012. Another name of note is Kevin Martins, who left BioWare to work as the lead designer on Diablo 3 and is now the head of design at Bungie. This is why it's almost impossible to overstate the influence of Baldur's Gate 2. The lessons the development team learned creating the game would directly carry over to later titles. There's a little bit of Irenicus in the way BioWare treats the introduction of the Reapers in Saren and Mass Effect. The morality systems in later BioWare games are clearly meant to convert that good and evil choices found in Baldur's Gate 2 into meaningful gameplay mechanics that determine the game's ending. And of course, there's no forgetting the romance options, which became a core feature of every BioWare title. There would be no Garrus or Cassandra if not for Jaheira in Baldur's Gate 2. I suppose I could go on, but by now I think you get the point.
Still, before we close out, there is one more aspect of Baldur's Gate 2 that must be mentioned, and I'm talking, of course, about the game's massive expansion. Now, Throne of Bhaal may have been sold as an expansion, but it was always intended to be the third part of the story, and is effectively the third installment in a trilogy. It's not as long as Baldur's Gate 2, but at around 20 to 30 hours for the main story, and 40 to 50 hours if you do everything. It is as long as the original Baldur's Gate, and longer than many later BioWare RPGs. Now, as would be expected, the expansion picks up shortly after the end of Baldur's Gate 2, and it teases out the one remaining plot point left unresolved: the player character's divine heritage as a child of Bhaal.
This epic story comes with an appropriately epic expansion to the game's level system, with the expansion allowing characters to reach a maximum level of 31 to 40 depending on the class, though most players end up in the mid to high 20s unless they go out of their way to complete every quest. This meant adding a bunch of high-level new spells and items, most of which are substantially more powerful than anything of Baldur's Gate 2. In this sense, the expansion really pushed the Infinity engine close to the breaking point. For example, Mark Dara mentioned in a developer chat hosted by Planet Baldur's Gate that the engine was limited to 24 possible spells per level. In another chat, Kevin Martins mentions the team pushing NPC counts to the engine's limits, which apparently was about 43 creatures in a battle.
The expansion also makes numerous gameplay changes that are directly in response to player and critical feedback of the sequel. Players who choose to pursue the game's romance options will find that they are substantially larger and that there is a more even distribution of dialogue between them. The stronghold idea remains as well, but instead of trying to stuff in a bunch of strongholds of different sizes for different classes, there's only one stronghold that is always key to the game's plot.
Also, unlike Baldur's Gate 2, where player choice has no real impact on the final ending, Throne of Bhaal offered different finales for characters with different alignments and a variety of NPC epilogue text that might appear depending on who is in your party and the status of your romance with the characters you could court. With that said, the way in which the ending is chosen is still pretty simple. It basically boils down to a handful of choices, not some grand judgment of all the choices made in the trilogy or even the expansion. Despite the epic scope of the plot and level system, the expansion's development was really a rush job. BioWare released it in June of 2001. Now, that is less than 1 year after the September 2000 release of Baldur's Gate 2. In part, the absolutely mad turnaround of the expansion is further proof of the team's incredible efficiency, a benefit of working 5 years on the same franchise and in the same game engine. It also further underscores the intense crunch that went into producing the franchise's massive games. Throne of Bhaal received rave reviews from critics on release. IGN called it, quote, one of the best role-playing experiences that you can ask for, and gave it a 9 out of 10. Computer Gaming World, meanwhile, gave it a 4.5 out of 5 and called it, quote, an epic end to a sweeping saga. Watchers Keep, a new dungeon, earned specific praise as the best yet from a series known for its crafty, clever, and multi-layered dungeon crawls, and it remains a fan favorite to this day. But that's not to say the expansion was without controversy. Modern fan opinion of the expansion seems less favorable, and it's not too hard to find Reddit threads from fans asking if the expansion is even worth playing. The complaints mainly revolve around the expansion's far tighter and largely more linear story, which lacks the open-ended feel of the sequel's second and third chapters.
Now this is an insightful complaint because, at least for me, the Throne of Bhaal expansion feels like the beginning of BioWare's swerve towards its more console-centric titles. It is at once an expansion that tries to provide more player expression through variable endings and deeper connections with non-player characters, but it is also a more linear and grounded game with a lot less opportunity to stray from the core narrative. In this, I think that it hints at the structure BioWare would adopt for later role-playing games like Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, and Jade Empire, all of which are narrow compared to the Baldur's Gate series.
Now, there was technically a third Baldur's Gate game in development called Baldur's Gate 3, The Black Hound. However, it didn't have anything to do with the story of the earlier games, and it was put into development by Black Isle Studios, creator of Planescape Torment and the Icewind Dale games, not by BioWare. The Baldur's Gate franchise was used for the game because the particulars of Interplay's access to the D&D license only applied to games in the Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale lines. The Black Hound began development shortly after the release of Throne of Bhaal. It would have discarded the Infinity engine, instead moving to an all-new 3D engine from Black Isle Studios. The game focused heavily on a faction system that would have had the player bargain with powerful groups like the Red Wizards and the Silver Ravens, with the results of these dealings swaying the game's narrative. The game progressed far into development, but in 2003, it was suddenly cancelled by Interplay, leaving Throne of Bhaal the last title in the franchise, until very recently, at least. Despite its somewhat rocky relationship with Baldur's Gate's most die-hard fans, I have to feel everyone at BioWare who had worked on Baldur's Gate had to be pleased with how the expansion turned out. It was a fitting end to a story told over 5 years, and that, for early BioWare employees like James Ohlen, was their life's work. You know, up until that point, at least. It also, and I think this is important, ended the Infinity engine on a high note, laying it to rest on its own terms. I think the reality is that the engine was not prepared to adapt to the changing desires of PC gamers now equipped with 3D graphics cards. Of course, Throne of Bhaal was not the end of the Baldur's Gate franchise itself, and certainly not the end of the games inspired by it. Over time, the game's incredible popularity has spawned an entire subgenre held together by the gravity of the Baldur's Gate franchise. This includes not only the obvious spiritual successors like Pillars of Eternity, Pathfinder Kingmaker, and Dragon Age Origins, but also games like Disco Elysium and Torment Tides of Numenera. And then there's the new Baldur's Gate 3. I have to admit that, like many fans of the earlier titles, I haven't been all that enthralled by the game, which is under development at Larian Studios, creator of Divinity Original Sin and its sequel, a pair of games themselves very much in line with Baldur's Gate. Still, I do imagine it will be successful, and that success could help bring the franchise to a new audience. Now, for those who dislike the new game, well, of course there's Beamdog Entertainment, which was founded by former BioWare employees Trent Oster and Cameron Topher. Their stewardship of the original franchise has expanded on the series with new characters, romance options, and bug and balance fixes.
Plus, you can now play Baldur's Gate 2, and the Throne of Bhaal expansion on the go with this, the Nintendo Switch version. And I have to say, I think this is pretty cool. Not only because you can play it on the go, but also because the game is now available in a durable cartridge format. I still have some of my original CDs of Baldur's Gate and Baldur's Gate 2, but they are pretty scratched up, and besides, they're kind of useless on modern PCs.
Things have even come full circle with the release of the Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus adventure for D&D 5th edition, the Heroes of Baldur's Gate sourcebook, and a PDF sourcebook called Minsk and Boo's Journal of Villainy. The last book was written by James Ohlen with additional design work from Brent Knowles. Ohlen is currently the head of Archetype Entertainment, a game studio run by Wizards of the Coast that is working on an unannounced project. Indeed, the entire Sword Coast has become a popular setting for D&D 5th edition campaigns.
I could go on, but this video has to end at some point, so I suppose it's time to wrap up this chapter of the Baldur's Gate franchise. Now, as you might imagine, a video like this takes dozens of hours of researching, writing, and filming and editing, so if you liked what you saw, make sure to give it a like, or if you want to see more videos like this in the future, be sure to subscribe. And if you really want to make sure videos like this can happen in the future, be sure to support on Patreon. You'll find a link to the Patreon in the description. With that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.